I never really questioned the story I was told about my mother. Since I was little, I heard that she had been the victim of a brutal crime, something so horrible that my father and grandmothers avoided going into details. Whenever they asked, they looked away, said it was better that I didn't know, and that some things should be buried. For a long time, I accepted this. I was just a child. The idea that my mother had been taken from me in such a violent way was scary enough. But as I got older, questions started piling up in my head. If the crime was so terrible, why have I never seen any news about it? No newspaper clippings, no reports, nothing. Her name does not appear in criminal records. There was no mention of the case anywhere. It was as if my mother had never existed. At 28, I decided I could no longer ignore this strange feeling that something was wrong. I searched through public records, internet forums, even contacted police files trying to find anything related to my mother's murder. Nothing. Not a police report, not a report, not a single clue. I confronted my father, and he was furious. He said I was digging a dangerous hole, that I should forget about it and get on with my life. My grandmothers reacted the same way, as if I were trying to reopen a wound they had fought to keep closed. But that only made me more suspicious. If my mother really was murdered, why didn't anyone want me to find out how? Decide to go further. If the police didn't have records, maybe I would find something at the hospitals or even at the registry office. That was when the first shock happened. There was no death certificate for my mother. Nothing. Her name appeared in civil records as if she were still alive. This doesn't make sense. How could someone have been brutally murdered without there being a single official document attesting to their death? The feeling that something was wrong became a certainty at that moment. I called the hospital where it was, proven that she had been taken after the crime, but no one found any information about a woman with her name being treated at that time. It was as if my mother had disappeared without a trace, as if the entire story I had been told was a carefully constructed lie. I started asking more distant relatives, people my father and grandmothers thought I would never reach out to. That's how I met a great-aunt, a very old woman, who hesitated for a long time before talking to me. On the phone, she said it was better to leave the past alone, that it could get me into trouble. But when I insisted, she said something that haunted me. Your father did what I needed done. I was paralyzed. What did she mean by that? I asked again. But she stopped talking, said she had already said too much, and hurriedly hung up. My heart was racing. All my life I had believed that my mother was a victim. But now, a horrible doubt began to grow inside me. What exactly did my father do that night? After that call, I realized that I needed to confront my father again. But this time, I wanted to be prepared. I went back to researching everything I could, trying to find any trace of my mother before she disappeared. I discovered she worked in a small office, but when I went there, the place hadn't been there for years. I asked a few people in town, and most didn't seem to remember her, as if her name had been erased from the collective memory. Only one man, the owner of an old grocery store, seemed serious to me when I told him who I was. He was clear, lowered his voice, and just said, "If I were you, I wouldn't touch this." Before I could ask anything else, he simply turned and walked into the store, leaving me alone with a chill down my spine. I came home that night with my head spinning. I didn't know who to trust anymore. My grandmothers avoided looking me in the eye, and my father acted like I was crazy. I decided to go through some old boxes in the basement, hoping to find anything that would help me understand what happened. It was then that I got an old folder full of yellow papers, newspaper clippings, and photos. Some images showed my mother smiling, holding my hand when I was a child. But at the bottom of the dough, I found something that made me freeze. It was a half-torn piece of paper, looking like a poorly made copy of an official document. At the top, there was a strange symbol, something I had never seen before. And at the bottom, a handwritten sentence. She knew too, much. My entire body went cold when I read those words. She knew too much. What did it do? My mother knew too much about what? I tried to find some more clues in the folder, but the papers didn't make much sense. There were scribbled notes, loose sentences that didn't connect, data that didn't stop meaning anything to me. But then, in the midst of the confusion, I found something that made everything even stranger. A photo of my father and a group of men dressed in suits, in a place that looked like an old salon. On the back, someone had written the date, night of May 17th. The same day my mother disappeared. The look on my father's face in the photo gave me goosebumps. He looked serious, almost tense, unlike the man I knew. I knew that if I asked him directly about it, he would never give me a real answer. So decide to throw a bait. The next day, I sat at the breakfast table and, with the most natural expression possible, said, "I found some old photos of Mom, including one from that day." The sound of his spoon falling onto the plate made me catch my breath. He looked at me for a few seconds as if he was trying to gauge how much I knew. Then he took a deep breath and said something that didn't make sense. "That was a long time ago. Forget it." But the way he said it didn't seem like advice. It sounded like a warning. After that conversation, something in the house changed. My father was quieter than usual, as if he was always watching me. My grandmothers started to avoid any direct contact with me. It was like all the comments about something I couldn't figure out. It just made me want to dig even deeper. That night, I waited until everyone was asleep and went back to the basement. I picked up the folder again and began to analyze the documents more carefully. That was when I noticed a detail that had previously gone unnoticed. Some papers had the names of people I had never heard of. There were data, locations, references to meetings that were particularly confidential. One of them, highlighted in red, simply said, "Purge completed," and the data was exactly 1 day after my mother disappeared. I felt my throat dry. What the hell could purge? And why was my mother's name among those papers? My heart was beating so loudly, I could hear it in the silence of the basement. Suddenly, a crack echoed upstairs. Someone was awake. I closed the folder as quickly as I could and pushed it back to the bottom of the box. I climbed the stairs, slowly trying not to make any noise. But when I reached the top, my father was standing there. He looked at me without blinking, his arms crossed, as if he already knew exactly what I had just seen. We looked at each other for a few seconds that seemed like an eternity, until he simply said, "If you keep this up, you'll end up just like her." That sentence stopped me straight away. The way he said it, it wasn't a threat in the traditional sense, but a real warning, like he was giving me one. Last chance to get out of this story, before it was too late. But at that moment, I no longer had a choice. I need to know what happened to my mother. So instead of backing away, I stared back at my father and the sender directly. What happened to her? He was silent for a while, then let out a heavy sigh and ran his hands over his face, as if he were exhausted. But instead of giving me an answer, he simply murmured, "You must never have started looking." And he left, leaving me there, alone in the dark of the room. After that, things got worse. My grandmothers started acting strangely, like they were scared. My father started leaving the house more often, and I noticed that he spent more time on the phone, talking quietly, locked in his room. I felt like I was being watched. Sometimes at night I would hear noises outside, footsteps on the porch, shadows moving near the windows. One night I woke up to a strange sound, a metallic click, as if someone was trying to open the front door with a key. My heart raced. I took my cell phone and walked slowly to the living room. The door was still closed, but the latch seemed to be moving. I waited a few minutes, keeping my breath. Then I heard something that chilled me to the bone. The sound of a car starting in front of the house, and someone driving away. The next morning, I decided that I needed to get out of that house. I threw some clothes into a backpack and tried not to attract attention. My plan was to drive to another town and continue investigating from there. But before I left, something made me return to the basement one last time. I took the folder with the documents and left without telling anyone. I drove for hours, trying to organize my thoughts, trying to understand what was happening. When I stopped at a gas station, I opened the folder again and started rereading the papers. It was then that I noticed something I hadn't noticed before. A handwritten phone number, right in the corner of one of the pages. I called without thinking twice. The phone rang 3 times before anyone answered. "Hello?" The voice was that of a woman, hoarse, tired. And in that instant, I knew. It was my mother. She wasn't dead. She never was. The line was silent for a few seconds, as if she too had realized who I was. I felt a chill running down my spine. "Where are you?" He wanted, almost without a voice. But before she could respond, I heard a muffled noise on the other end, as if the phone had been snatched from her hand. Then another male voice spoke, low and firm. "Stop looking." And the call dropped. Since that day, I have never been able to contact him again. I never heard her voice again. But now I know the truth. My mother was not murdered. She was turned off. And whoever did this is still around. Moving into that apartment was a problem. After months of searching for an affordable and quiet place, I finally found a little spot that seemed perfect. It was small but cozy and located in a quiet neighborhood with tree-lined streets and few noisy neighbors. At first, everything seemed normal. I spent my days organizing my things, trying to transform that space into a home. But on the 3rd night, while drinking tea by the window, I noticed something strange. In the building opposite, 1 floor above mine, an elderly man was standing on the balcony, looking directly at me. He did nothing but stand there, motionless, with a blank expression. I found it a little uncomfortable, but I tried to ignore it. Maybe he was just a lonely neighbor with nothing better to do. But he never left there. Every night when I looked out on that porch, he was there. I never saw him move. I never saw him blink. It didn't matter what time it was. 2 in the morning, noon, dusk. He was always there, in the same position, looking at my apartment. I even started joking with myself, saying that I was just one of those eccentric old men who like to spy on other people's lives. But then I started to notice something that made my stomach sink. No one seemed to notice his presence. Neighbors passed by his building without so much as a glance up. Even when a woman watered the plants on the next porch, it was as if he simply wasn't there. That started to really bother me. I started closing the curtains all the time, but whenever I forgot and looked outside, there he was, property, observing. It was as if he knew exactly when I was spying on him. One night I took courage and mentioned the old man to my building manager, a nice lady who always made a point of asking if I was enjoying the apartment. But when I described the man on the porch, her face turned pale. She frowned and said with complete certainty, "No one has lived in that apartment for years." My stomach turned. I tried to argue, describing the old man in detail, but she just shook her head. "This apartment is empty, honey. The last residents left a long time ago." I laughed, thinking she was just uninformed, and decided to prove that I was right. That night, I took out my cell phone and pointed a camera at the balcony of the other building, ready to record this strange man. But when I looked at the screen, he wasn't there. I took the phone away from my face and looked directly at the porch. And he was there. My blood ran cold. It wasn't possible. My fingers went numb, and I almost dropped my phone. I raised the camera again, trying to adjust the focus, but there was nothing on the screen but the empty porch. I looked straight at the other building, and there it was, in exactly the same place. My heart started to pound. I could see it with the naked eye, but the camera didn't capture anything. I turned away from the window, closed the curtains, and tried to convince myself that it was just an illusion. Maybe it was some weird reflex, or I was paranoid. But at that moment, for the first time, an icy certainty came over me. This man was not normal. That night, bad dorm. Any noise would make me jump out of bed, and every shadow in my room seemed darker than usual. But the worst happened in the early morning. I woke up suddenly, feeling like I was being watched. My room was completely dark, and the silence was suffocating. I slowly turned to the side, and that's when I saw it. His silhouette was standing on the other side of the corridor. My chest seized up, and for a second, my body decided to move. I knew I had locked the door. I knew all the windows were closed. But he was there, inside my apartment. The air became heavy, almost impossible to breathe. I can't look away or move. The old man was still standing in the hallway, in the same posture he always had on the balcony. But now, seeing him so close, I noticed something that made my stomach turn. He wasn't blinking. He wasn't even breathing. He just stared at me, as if he was waiting for something. My entire body screamed at me to run, but I knew somehow it wouldn't do any good. With a slow movement, I pulled the blanket up, trying to hide my face, and closed my eyes tightly. My heart was beating so hard that it seemed to echo throughout the room. Then I heard a sound that chilled me to the bone. Steps. Not rushed, not dragged. Just slow, steady footsteps approaching my bed. I wanted to scream, but my throat was blocked. Every second the sound got closer until I felt something unthinkable. A weight on the edge of the mattress. He was there, sitting next to me. The room was cold, the silence crushing. Every cell in my body begged me not to open my eyes. Then everything stopped. The steps. Oh, wait. Even the air seemed stagnant. And it was at that moment that a low, hoarse voice whispered very close to my ear. "Now you see me." My entire body froze. I didn't want to believe what I had just heard. The voice didn't sound like it belonged to anything alive. It was a fight, drawn out, like an echo coming from a very distant place. My eyes were still closed, and at that moment, I knew that if I looked at him, something worse would happen. Everything inside me screamed at me to stay still, as if my life depended on it. Time seemed to stretch. I don't know if it was minutes or hours, but I stood there, paralyzed, until, suddenly, I felt the mattress become lighter. The weight on my side is gone. The room was still cold, but the silence now seemed less dense. Still without opening my eyes, I reached a trembling hand over to the nightstand and pressed the switch. The light blinked a few times before stabilizing. When I finally had the courage to look, the room was empty, but I knew he had been there. The air still carried that suffocating feeling, that presence that was impossible to ignore. My hands shook as I lifted the bed and ran to the apartment door. It was locked, exactly how I left it, before going to sleep. I searched the entire apartment, checked every window, every dark corner. There was no sign of forced entry, no physical evidence that anyone had entered. But something told me that if I looked out the window now, he would be there. So I took a deep breath, my heart pounding in my chest, and finally opened the curtain. I didn't know what to expect, but I knew he would be there. And I was. On the balcony of the building opposite, standing as always, looking directly at me. But now, there was something different. He was smiling. A small, almost imperceptible smile. But it made my blood run cold. For the first time, he reacted. For the first time, he knew that I knew. I closed the curtain so hard that I almost ripped it off and moved away from the window, feeling my breathing hitch. That wasn't normal. He wasn't just a weird old man or a nosy neighbor. Whatever he wasn't human. The next morning, I packed my things and left that apartment, without looking back. No matter the damage, I would never set foot there again. I would never walk down that hallway, in the dark again. I would never look at that balcony again. But sometimes, when I'm alone at home, and I look out the window, I feel a shiver go up my spine. Because deep down, a part of me knows the truth. He's still watching me. We just wanted a quiet weekend. It was supposed to be something simple. 3 days of camping in an isolated forest, far from the hustle and bustle of the city. Me, my friend Diego and his sisters Camila and Julia drove for almost 3 hours until we arrived at the place. The plan was to relax, drink a few beers and tell stories around the campfire. Everything seemed perfect on the first day. The forest was dense, silent, and the only thing we heard was the wind shaking the trees. But at the end of the afternoon, while we were collecting wood for the fire, we noticed something strange. There were people watching us. At first, I thought it was all in my head. But when I looked again, I saw clearly. Among the trees, there were figures standing still, motionless. You couldn't see their faces, only as silhouettes. They were far away, maybe 50 meters away, completely still. I spoke to the others, and Diego also saw them. Camilla laughed, saying that they must have been other campers or perhaps locals. But something bothered me. They shouldn't be camping. There were no backpacks, flashlights, or anything normal. They were just there, standing, looking at us. We tried to ignore it and continued with what we were doing. But as night fell, the feeling that something was wrong only got worse. We built a fire, cooked something quickly, and tried to distract ourselves. But no one could forget those figures. Every now and then, I looked into the forest, hoping to see them again. But there was nothing but darkness between the trees. The problem is that it didn't calm me down. If it was just other people camping, why were they there before and not now? And worse, where did they go without making any noise? It wasn't until after midnight that things were really strange. We were sitting around the fire when Camilla, who was further away, suddenly froze. "There's someone there," she whispered. My heart raced. We looked in the direction she was pointing, and they were all there, again. Closer. Much closer. The same figures, motionless, without saying a word. There were 5 or 6 of them, scattered among the trees, as if they were sneaking around without us noticing. Worst of all, there was still no sound, no trampled leaves, no broken branches. They were just there. Nobody knew anything. We just stood there, looking at them, and they looked at us. The fire crackled, casting distorted shadows across the ground. But those figures remained perfectly still. My chest opened with a primal sense of fear. Something was deeply wrong. Diego, who was always the most skeptical of the group, stood up and mentioned, "Hey, who are you?" No response, not a single movement. "If you're scaring us, that's it, okay?" More silence. The only thing that happened was Camilla grabbing my arm so hard that her nails almost pierced my skin. Then she whispered something that made me freeze. "There are more of them now." My eyes swept the darkness, and I realized she was right. The shadows between the planned trees multiply. Where there had previously been 5 or 6, there were now at least twice as many, and they were even closer. Something about the way they approached, without any sound, without any transparent movement, made my body freeze. It felt wrong, inhuman. Julia was already gathering our things, murmuring that we needed to get out of there immediately. Nobody argued. We put out the fire in a hurry, grabbed the lanterns, and ran back down the path. But it didn't take long for us to realize something that made us lose our breath. No matter how much we ran, those things continued to follow us. The only thing we could hear was the sound of our own footsteps crunching through the earth and dry grass. Flashlights shook in our hands as we tried to follow the trail back to the car. But those things, they were still there, following us. I looked around and saw the silhouettes between the trees, always at the same distance, always still when we looked, directly at them. But every time we looked away, they were obviously a little closer. My chest burned from running so much. My heart pounded in my ears, and the only thing going through my head was, how are they moving without making a sound? After what seemed like hours of non-stop running, we finally saw clarity of where we had left the car. A wave of interruption almost made me cry. But when we got close, Diego was the first notary. He reported something, ran to the driver's door and tried to open it. But the lock was broken. Someone had tampered with the car. We desperately tried to open the doors, but they were all locked. The hood was promoted raised as if it had been offered. And it was at that moment that we realized the worst. The figures were on the edge of the clearing, closer than ever. Now they weren't just shadows. We could see their faces. I don't know how to properly describe what I saw. Their faces weren't right. It was as if they were human. But something about them felt off, wrong in a way my brain couldn't understand. The eyes were too deep, the mouths were slightly distorted, and the skin pale, grayish, as if it hadn't seen the sun in centuries. But the worst of all was realizing that they were smiling. A light, almost imperceptible smile, as if they knew we had nowhere to run. Camilla began to cry softly, while Diego kicked the car door, desperate to open it. Julia was shaking so much that she could barely hold a flashlight. And me. I just wanted to wake up from that nightmare. It was then that we realized we couldn't do anything else. We needed to run. No car, no plan, no nothing. Just get out of there. So, without even thinking, we darted back into the forest. The flashlights shook in our hands, illuminating only flashes of the path, and I knew we were straying from the main trail. But it didn't matter. Anywhere was better than this. The problem is, they were still following us. No rush, no running, but always appearing between the trees, as if guiding us somewhere. And in that moment, I had the worst feeling ever. Maybe this whole time, this was exactly what they wanted. With every minute, it became more difficult to breathe. My legs burned, my head spun, and the flashlight in my hand shook so much it barely illuminated the path. But we couldn't stop. The worst thing was that no matter how hard we ran, those beings always appeared between the trees, at the same distance. They can't run. It was like you knew exactly where we were going. Panic was starting to take over me when Julia tripped and fell hard to the ground. "Get up!" Diego remembered, pulling her by the arm. But in that second of distraction, something changed. The silence, which was once absolute, was broken by a low sound. A strange murmur, coming from all directions. It was no ordinary voice. It was something guttural, distorted, almost like an ecological ecosystem. It seemed like a jumble of words I couldn't understand, as if they were fragments of a forgotten language. Camilla began to sob, desperate. I felt every cell in my body begging to escape. But then, the sound stopped, and that's when we saw it. Right in front of us, between the trees, was a different figure, bigger, not like the others. Tall, too much guidance, with long arms that are wrong for a human body. But the worst part, he had no face, just smooth, pale skin, where the eyes, nose, and mouth should be. And she said one of the hands, pointing directly at us. That thing doesn't move, but the mere sight of it drains all the strength from my body. It was as if I were frozen, unable to breathe, unable to think, unable to do anything but look at that non-existent face. Time seemed to slow down. Julia grabbed my arm so hard that I felt her nails digging into my skin, but I could barely react. Silence once again took over the forest, a heavy, suffocating silence, as if everything around us had stopped. Then, without warning, the figures around us began to move. Not walking, don't run, just appearing closer. Every time we blinked, every time we looked away, they were a step forward. It was at that moment that I understood. We no longer have a way out. So Diego did the only thing that seemed possible. He picked up a stone from the ground and threw it at that tall figure. it was useless. The stone passed through the space where she was as if there was nothing there. And it was at that moment that everything fell apart. The forest seemed to spin around us. The shadows blended, and a deafening sound filled the air. A sound that shouldn't exist, somewhere between a deep hum and a muffled scream. The ground seemed to disappear beneath our feet. And then we blacked out. I don't remember what happened next. All I know is that I woke up with my face in the dirt. The sunlight is already shining through the trees. The car was still far away, but it was there. We ran to him at the unlocked doors, the key in the ignition. Neither of us said a word until we were back, on the road. And since that day, we never spoke about what we saw in that forest. But sometimes when I'm alone at night, I feel like I'm still being watched. I have always had sleep paralysis since I was a teenager. That horrible feeling of waking up and not being able to move, while the room seems darker and suffocating than usual. But it was never anything more than that. I knew it was knowledge explained by science, a problem between the brain and the body that sometimes caused hallucinations. So, I learned to ignore it. But in recent months, something has changed. The hallucinations became more vivid, more real. And there was always something in the room with me. A shadow standing at the foot of the bed, tall, thin, completely still. At first, I thought it was my mind playing tricks. But then I started to notice something strange. I woke up with bruises on my body. At first, they were small, simple to ignore. Blue marks on my arm, as if I had hit myself without realizing it. But then it started to appear in places where it didn't make sense, like on my ribs, on my calves. Dark spots, as if someone had held me tightly. One night, when I was finally able to move after an episode, I ran to the bathroom to turn on the light and look in the mirror. There were finger marks around my wrist. That was enough to really scare me. I lived alone. If no one was touching me, who was leaving these marks? I tried to convince myself that all this had a logical explanation. Maybe I got confused in my sleep, bumping into our furniture without realizing it. But deep down, I knew it didn't make sense. The bruises were symmetrical, as if invisible. Hands remained on me. And the worst, sleep paralysis was happening more frequently. Before, it was once or twice a month. Now they happened almost every night. And the shadow, it was getting closer and closer. Before, she was just standing at the foot of the bed, motionless, just a silhouette in the dark. But the last time, when I opened my eyes, I saw that she was standing next to my bed, leaning over me. That's when I decided to install a camera in the room. I need answers. I put my phone on a tripod and set it to record while I slept. The next day, I woke up with a strange feeling, as if I had had another episode. But I couldn't remember anything. My body was sore. The bruises were even worse. I picked up the cell phone with my hands shaking and started watching the recording. At first, it was just me sleeping normally. Then, around 3 a.m, something happened. My body started to move. The video showed something impossible. At first, I only moved slightly, as if I were having a troubled dream. But then around 3:23 a.m., my body started twitching in a way that didn't feel natural. My arms bent at strange angles. My legs moved as if something was pulling on them. My chest rose and fell unevenly, as if I was struggling to breathe. But the worst was yet to come. At one point, my head turned sharply to the side, as if I were looking at something in the corner of the room. And that's when I saw it. In the corner of the screen, where there was nothing before, a shadow began to form. She didn't appear suddenly. She didn't appear like a figure crossing the camera. She was simply there. At first, it was just a dark spot in the darkness of the room, but little by little, it moved. It didn't walk. It didn't slide. But it seemed to expand, as if it were growing within space. And then, with my breath catching in my throat, I saw something that made me almost break the cell phone. The moment the shadow moved from the bed, my body stopped moving, as if it was controlling me. I wanted to stop the video. I just wanted to turn off my cell phone and pretend none of it was real. But my fingers were locked, and my eyes were focused on the screen, as if I needed to see it through to the end. The shadow stood next to the bed for a while, just me watching. Then something worse happened. My body, which had previously twitched, was now completely still. But my mouth started to move. It was not a spasm, nor an unconscious murmur. I was talking, but the audio in the video was almost all a heavy, muffled silence, as if the room itself was just the sound. The little I could hear was a slurred whisper, a voice that didn't sound like it. My breathing became shallow. I turned up the volume and rewound that part several times, trying to understand what I was saying. But the words were distorted, jumbled. Only after listening to it at least 10 times did I finally understand something. 4 words. Words that I didn't remember saying, but that came out of my mouth in that video. They were whispered unevenly, as if something was speaking through me. "You let me in." My stomach turned. I rewound the video several times, hearing that phrase over and over again, trying to find some rational explanation. But there were none. I didn't remember saying that. I couldn't imagine a reason to say something like that. Enter where? Let what in? The shadow was still there, next to the bed, motionless, as if it was waiting for something. Then, in the last minute of the video, she started moving. This time, on top of me. It wasn't an attack. It wasn't a sudden movement. She simply leaned over my body and disappeared, as if it had been sucked into me. And the moment that happened, my eyes opened to the recording. But here's the worst of all. In the video, when my eyes opened, they were completely black. No pupils, no white. Just 2 dark orbs reflecting some light from the room. The me in the video stared at the ceiling for a few seconds, without blinking, before slowly turning his head toward the camera. I almost threw the phone away when I saw my own face looking straight at me, smiling. But I didn't remember any of that. For me, I had just woken up and been tired, like any other night. So, who or what was in my body at that moment? I turned off the video at the same time. My fingers were shaking so much that I almost dropped my cell phone. My heart was racing. My mouth was dry. That wasn't normal. It wasn't a trick of the lighting. It wasn't a problem with the camera. It was me. But it didn't feel like me. It was my face, my body. But something inside me knew it wasn't me there. Something was looking at me from inside the screen. Something that now lived inside me. And the worst thing was, even after seeing that, I couldn't remember anything about that night. No strange sensations, no dreams. Nothing. Just the tiredness and the bruises. Since that day, I have never watched the recording again. In fact, I deleted the video at the same time. But that didn't change anything. As paralysis continues, bruises appear more frequently. Sometimes I wake up with a wound that I don't remember inflicting. And the scariest thing? Some mornings I wake up with my cell phone next to me, with new videos recorded during the night. I never remember putting my cell phone on to record. I never watch them. I don't care what I'm going to see. But sometimes, before deleting the recording, I watch the first few seconds. And nowadays, in the first frame, my body is still on the bed, but my eyes are already open. I've never been one to believe those stories about haunted schools. When I took the job as a teacher at this former Catholic institution, I heard some legends from students about strange things happening at night, but I always dismissed them as childish imagination. Every old school has its stories, right? But what caught my attention was the insistence with which the students talked about a girl in the basement. It wasn't just a joke or a story to scare people. They talked about it with an uncomfortable seriousness. Some said they had already seen it, standing at the end of the dark corridor, looking at them. Others spoke of complaints coming from there on silent nights. But what bothered me most was one detail. None of them knew her name. At first, I ignored it. I didn't want food superstitions. But one night, while I was grading tests alone in the staff room, I heard something strange. A muffled noise like a scratch coming from the hallway. I looked at the clock. It was already 11 at night. The school was empty. Only me and the janitor were supposed to be there. I left the room, expecting to see a window flapping in the wind, but the hallway was completely silent. I walked a little and, without knowing why, I looked at the stairs that led down to the basement. The door was open. This doesn't make sense. The caretaker always locked it at the end of the day. And then, as I looked, I heard a step below, which was slight, but impossible to ignore. A single step, as if someone was down there, waiting. My first occurrence was trying to rationalize. Maybe the janitor was checking on something, or some student had hidden as part of a stupid prank. But the more I thought about it, the more it didn't make sense. The basement was always locked, and the janitor had already left earlier that night. The school was completely empty. Or at least it should have been. My heart started to beat faster, but I forced myself to walk down the steps slowly. The air in. The basement was heavy. Smelled musty and dusty, as if no one had been there for a long time. The only light came from a dim bulb flickering in the ceiling. I looked around the room. Old shelves full of dusty books, broken chairs piled in the corners, boxes of old files. And then I saw something that made me freeze. On the floor, where dust had accumulated for years, there were footprints, small, like a child's. But they weren't just normal marks. The footprints started in the middle of the basement, out of nowhere, as if someone had just appeared there. I was paralyzed. Those footprints didn't make sense. There were no other markings leading there, no indication that anyone had entered or exited. They just started in the middle of the basement. My chest opened, and a primal instinct inside me told me to get out of there immediately. But instead, I continue. I ran the tip of my shoe over one of the footprints, hoping it was just a dust effect or a play of light. But they were real. I could see them clearly, too small to belong to any adult. And it was at that moment that I heard the sound again. Another step. This time, more soon. The noise came from behind one of the bookshelves in the corner of the basement. My body tensed and my mind struggled between running away or finding out what was happening at once. I took a deep breath and, with the cell phone flashlight shaking in my hand, I walked slowly to the bookshelf. The silence was oppressive. My every step sends dust rising through the still air. When I got close enough, I looked behind the bookshelf. There was no one. But before I could consider it, I felt something behind me. An intense cold, as if something was standing there, watching me. The cold took over the environment in a way that made me hold my breath. It was a different cold. It's not caused by wind or temperature change, but something deeper, denser. My skin crawled, and a primal fear took hold of me. I knew I wasn't alone. Slowly, I turned my face, hoping to see something, and I saw it. In the reflection of the dusty glass of an old cabinet, a silhouette stood behind me. A girl, small, thin, wearing a light dress and her face covered by disheveled dark hair. Stop, without moving. My entire body seized up. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But all I could do was stay there, despite that horrible reflection. Then, she did something that made me lose my breath completely. She turned her head slowly. Not the reflection. The real her. I can't move. Her head slowly turned, but her body was still. Her disheveled hair fell to the side, revealing a pale face with hollow, empty eyes, as if there was nothing inside her but darkness. My breathing became short. My heart raced. In the reflection, I saw his lips parting slightly, but no sound came out. Then, before I could react, the basement lights flickered and went out completely. My brief absolute took over the environment, and all I could hear was my own rapid breathing. I was alone in the dark, or at least, I wanted to believe I was. Because of that oppressive silence, a new sound was present. Steps, small, light, circling around me. On the dust-covered floor, I could hear each step shifting the ancient dust. My instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. Then, right next to my ear, a low, husky whisper pierced the dark. "You found me." The sound of that voice cuts me. It wasn't just a common suggestion. It was something wrong. As if there were more than one voice speaking at the same time, I darted towards the stairs. My feet slipped in the dust. My hands shook as they felt for the walls in the total darkness. But the footsteps behind me continued, small, fast, now following me. I didn't look back. I couldn't look. I reached the top of the stairs and pushed the door with all my might, feeling the cold night air hitting my face. The basement was dark, but I knew she was still there. I closed the door tightly and ran down the hallway, not caring if anyone saw me. Since that night, I never went down there again. But something changed. Every night as I lock my room and prepare to leave, I feel a shiver run down my spine. Because now, every time I walk past the basement, the door is ajar, even when I'm sure no one has opened it. I was 13 years old at the time and spent the summer holidays at my grandfather's house in the countryside. He lived in one of those old houses, far from the city, with a huge backyard that opened directly onto an open field. The nights there were pitch black, broken only by the solitary streetlight at the entrance to the house and the dim light from the porch. My grandfather, a man of few words, always told me that he liked the silence of the night. But on this particular night, the silence felt different, heavy, as if the world outside was holding its breath. I didn't think much of it until I heard the first noise, a low shuffling sound coming from the backyard. I thought it was a dog or some big animal. Inland, it wasn't uncommon to hear coyotes prowling around, but something about the noise bothered me. My grandfather, sitting in the rocking chair, stopped smoking his pipe mid-puff. He stood there, motionless, eyes fixed on the darkness of the yard. "Be still," he whispered, without even looking at me. I had never heard that urgency in his voice before. My stomach turned. The sound outside changed. Now it was a low rustling, as if something was moving in the grass, gliding. And then came the whisper. A hoarse voice, almost a hiss, speaking too quickly for me to understand. My body froze. I looked at my grandfather, waiting for some explanation. But he remained standing still, with an expression I had never seen before. It wasn't fear. It was something worse. It was recognition. The thing outside kept whispering, words I couldn't make out. But the more I listened, the more I felt a shiver run up my spine, as if my body understood something that my mind couldn't grasp. My grandfather got up slowly, without making a sound, and picked up the lantern that hung on the porch wall. He held her tight, but didn't care. "Stay here," he murmured, and before I could protest, he started down the steps. I wanted to stop him, to tell him it wasn't safe, but my mouth felt glued shut. I stood there, watching him walk away into the darkness. With every step he took, the whispers grew quieter, as if the thing was waiting, watching. Then suddenly, the voice stopped. The silence was so abrupt that I felt my ears ringing. My grandfather froze in the middle of the yard. He stood there, breathing deeply, looking at some spot in the dark that I couldn't see. Then he said something, too quiet for me to hear. A second later, he took a step back. And that's when I saw it. Between the shadows of the trees, something moved. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't human. It was tall and thin, almost like a shadow cast in the night. But what terrified me was the way he leaned forward slightly, as if he were listening to my grandfather, as if he recognized him too. My grandfather remained still, and for a moment, I thought he was talking to it. I couldn't hear what he was saying, but his lips moved slowly, as if he chose each word carefully. The figure in the dark didn't move, either. It just sat there, bent over, waiting. My chest hurt so hard my heart was pounding, and my legs were locked. I wanted to scream, run, do something. But something told me I shouldn't interrupt. Then suddenly, my grandfather turned off the flashlight and turned to me. "Come in," he said in a dry tone, offering no explanation. I hesitated, looking at the thing in the yard, but it was no longer there, as if it had never existed. I entered the house in a daze, with my heart still pounding in my chest. My grandfather locked the door behind me, checked the windows, and turned off all the lights. "What was that?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, but it sounded shaky. He gave me a stern look, the kind that told me not to insist. But before sitting down, he muttered something that chilled me to the bone. "He shouldn't be here." I wanted to ask who he was, but the silence that followed made it clear to me that I would have no answer. The rest of the night dragged on in, suffocating silence. My grandfather sat in the living room armchair, looking at the door, as if waiting for something. I barely closed my eyes. The next morning, I woke up to the smell of strong coffee and burning wood. My grandfather was already up, as if he hadn't spent the night awake. But something about him was different. He seemed distracted, restless, as if his mind was far away. I sat at the table and watched as he stirred his coffee without drinking it, staring at the window with a somber expression. That's when I heard him murmur, "He's back." The phrase was said so quietly that it almost went unnoticed. But the way he held the cup, his fingers stiff, white from so much pressure, made me understand that it was big. Much bigger than I could comprehend. After breakfast, I went to the backyard, hoping to find some sign of what happened the night before. But there was nothing. No footprints, no broken branches. Nothing to prove that thing was there. It was as if everything had been a delusion. But when I went back inside, I saw my grandfather on the phone, speaking quietly, his voice thick with urgency. I stood behind the door, listening. Yes, I saw it. He's back." There was a pause. "We have to prepare." My body felt cold. I wanted to ask who he was, what it meant to prepare, but my gut told me that maybe I didn't want to know the answer. My grandfather hung up the phone and stood there for a moment, just breathing deeply. When he saw me at the door, his expression changed. He tried to hide it, but I had already seen the fear in his eyes. It wasn't the kind of fear you have of a wild animal or a thief. It was an old fear, one that came from something he already knew. "Go get your things," he said bluntly. "We're leaving here for a few days." That took me by surprise. Never in all the holidays I spent there did he suggest leaving the house. "But why?" I asked, feeling my throat tighten. He sighed and ran a hand over his face, as if he was choosing his words carefully. "Because he never comes, just once." As I walked up the stairs to get my backpack, I felt a strange chill. Something inside me said that, no matter how much we left, it wouldn't end. My grandfather knew what was happening. He knew who, or what, that visitor in the yard was. And worse, he knew it would come back. But the question that haunted me more than any other was, why did he recognize that? What else was my grandfather hiding? I threw some clothes in my backpack, but my head was racing. I wanted to ask my grandfather everything, get any explanation from him. But something in the way he moved around the house, closing curtains and locking doors, told me he wouldn't answer. As I walked down the stairs, I heard the sound of the old wooden trunk being dragged into the office. I've never seen my grandfather touch it before. I approached slowly, and through the crack in the half-open door, I saw something that I will never forget. He was holding an old rifle, but what scared me was what he took out afterwards. A yellowed sheet full of strange hand-drawn symbols. He looked at it for a while, then folded the paper and put it in his pocket. It was then that he saw me peeking. "I said, get your stuff!" he grumbled, slamming the door shut. I swallowed hard and did as he said. Minutes later, we were already in the truck, driving along the dirt road in silence. The sun was shining brightly, and for a moment, all the madness of last night seemed distant. But then my grandfather looked in the rearview mirror and his face turned pale. I turned to see what it was. At the top of the hill, where the yard met the forest, there was a shadow, high, thin, standing still, watching. Before I could say anything, my grandfather pressed his foot on the gas. "Don't look back," he ordered. I obeyed. But to this day, even if I don't want to, I still see that thing when I close my eyes. We drove for hours without exchanging a word. My grandfather seemed to be fighting his thoughts, gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles were white. We only stopped when we reached a small town miles away. He rented a room in a cheap motel, and told me to rest. But how does anyone rest after what we've seen? While he went to reception, I sat on the bed, looking at the ceiling, trying to come up with some rational explanation. But nothing made sense. Then I heard his voice again, on the phone. This time he saw me with the boy. My stomach turned. What did that mean? What did this thing want? That night, I didn't sleep. Neither did my grandfather. He sat by the window, rifle in his lap, watching the road. For the first time, I realized he wasn't just a grumpy old man living alone. He was hiding from something. Or rather, running away. But escaping, that seemed impossible. 2 days later, we returned home. Everything was the way we left it. But my grandfather was never the same. He began to reinforce the locks, burn the sheet of symbols he had saved, and every night he stayed on the balcony until the sun rose. He never spoke about the visitor again, and I never asked again. But one thing I know. In that backyard, between the shadows, something still watches us, and one day he may return.